Hi, my name is Nandini Sikand, and the talk today is called Reform is Not the Answer, Policing in Schools. So let's begin. I'd like to begin with a story. For once, my son was ranting more than I was. Let me explain. The elementary school that my children attend has a DARE program. It's also known as the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, and is conducted in collaboration with local law enforcement. According to the DARE website, they provide students with the knowledge and tools they need to resist drugs, alcohol, and other high-risk behaviors. The program has been around since 1983 and is still favored by many school districts, even though studies have shown the program to be ineffective. Substance use is not as simple as just say no, but is most often linked to trauma, violence, abuse, and substance use disorders. Anyway, one evening, my son was completing his DARE workbook, and he started to show me pictures of how most of the dark-skinned kids were drug users and a bad influence, and in less than favorable situations, while all the white kids were in well-lit environments, not using drugs. And if white kids were in bad situations, they were always cast as the heroes, the ones to say no, the ones to walk away. There were a few exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, this pattern held across the workbook. Our conversation was on fire, and so he decided to ask his teacher about it the next day, which he did. And the teacher's response? Well, maybe those pictures just reflect reality. My kid, who was rarely stunned into silence, was dumbstruck. Later, he tried to continue the conversation with a nearby teacher's aide who told him, "You're seeing racism where there isn't." Finally, the DARE class took place with the police officer who conducts the program, who told him, "The book is older, from the 70s, so the images are probably older too." And that was it. 2 years later, my youngest in 5th grade went through the same workbook. Same school, different cop, different homeroom teacher. This time, the students put questions in a cardboard box, and he asked the same question. Why are the black kids shown in a negative light and the white kids are not? When the police officer reached for my child's question, he read it and handed it to his teacher, who also read it and didn't read his question out loud. No response, nothing. They proceeded to the next question as if nothing had happened. After class, he went up to his teacher to ask why she never responded, and she explained to him that the workbook had nothing to do with them, and that they didn't write the text or choose the pictures. To be filed under another lost conversation to talk about race. For me, this story shows many things. How teachable moments about race and visuality are silenced in schools. What we think about race comes through various images, and we need to learn how to read these images, images that are not value-free. How white experiences are centered in the classroom and how talking about race is taboo, and any kind of difference outside of whiteness is seen as a deviation. Even our current focus on anti-racism in education centers whiteness and white learning. But this story is also indicative of how a police presence in schools begins at a very early age. It is always presented as that the police are there to keep us safe. But who exactly are they keeping safe? Police presence in schools is normalized through programs like DARE in elementary schools and through SROs or school resource officers in middle schools and high schools. Currently, 2/3 of high school students attend with a police officer on their school campus. The SRO program started in Flint, Michigan in 1953, motivated to improve police and youth relationships, just 1 year before Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. This meant that now white children would be learning alongside black children. Many school districts opposed it, and slowly other districts over the years began to widely use police officers in their schools. So the normalization of police officers in schools is very much tied to desegregation and motivated by the fear of, quote, dangerous delinquents and undesirables, and of course, the protection of white property. We have seen horrifying videos of children handcuffed, beaten, arrested, traumatized, choked, slammed, tasered, suspended, expelled, and placed in detention. These children are disproportionately Black and Latinx and Indigenous, and sometimes as young as 6 years old. But there is also the everyday criminalization of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students that we don't see as clearly, which continues through various disciplinary measures, sometimes enforced by police, but also by teachers and counselors. This is done through a variety of measures: tardiness ticketing, citations, arrests, demerits, zero tolerance policies, etc. Young filmmaker Nairi Spearman tackles this in her film, No Excuses, about her own experiences in charter schools in Connecticut. The pandemic has only deepened these inequalities. Earlier this year, a 15-year-old Black girl with ADHD was incarcerated for not completing her homework. Yes, incarcerated. Lisa Marie Cacho, in her book Social Death, Racialized Rightlessness, the Criminalization of the Unprotected, refers to criminalization as the process of being surveilled and punished, but also deemed unworthy of protection. The criminalizing of populations of color is premised on their devaluation in the context of racial capitalism. So why do we need cops in classrooms? And extending this question to higher ed, why does university administration have this easy relationship with police and public safety? Even though BIPOC college students tell us that they are routinely harassed by local and university police. Increased school shootings have been the latest justification for cops in schools, but have not increased protection for these students. Since the 1999 Columbine school shooting, $750 million federal dollars were allocated to hire 6,500 police officers. And with each school shooting, the call to hire more police officers increased. We cannot reform our way out of this. Recent uprisings have called to defund and abolish the police because we are right to be suspicious of reform. In the United States, policing began with slavery. White citizens tasked to police Black bodies. Policing was then institutionalized with slave patrols. Policing has long ties to the carceral state, and scholars like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore have shown us that the history of prisons is also a history of reform. Reform measures in policing now call for more workshops for police officers and how maybe not to use a chokehold. Reform has a long and ugly carceral history, and we cannot reform our way out of this. Community policing has been at the center of crime reform bills since the mid-20th century. And scholar Naomi Murakawa shows how billions of dollars were approved for these bills and supported by Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. These measures have only strengthened the carceral state over the years. What if instead we spent this money on mental health professionals of color and guidance counselors, built communities and demilitarized our schools, and invested in transformative and restorative justice alternatives instead of disciplinary outcomes that set up a school to prison pipeline? Reform in policing is simply a reinvention of older systems of discrimination, refunneling funds away from where we need them and a justification for increased forms of surveillance. How do we get to it being okay to shoot someone in the back 7 times or kneel on their neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? We get there by the steps we take early in our lives. We get there by uncritically participating in practices that devalue the lives of others. We get there by failing to question the presence of police in elementary schools, by signing on for disciplinary measures that are punitive rather than based in care. We get there by not taking the time to answer questions about systemic racism early on. So how do we proceed? We get there by doing the work. The Alliance for Educational Justice has a toolkit on their website, wecametolearn.com. The Alliance calls for dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. The Alliance also recognizes that any removal of policing in schools must be grounded in abolition. Abolition is not about making cops in schools more effective, but is a movement built on care and justice. And without abolition, we will just rechannel the carcerality in other ways. It's time to imagine something new, a freedom movement for our students and our communities, an abolition that is already taking place.